Hello, my lovely listeners. Welcome to the Culture Compute podcast. I'm your host, Sai Gattupalli. Today's episode comes to you from the Advanced Learning Technologies Lab at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I have a quick announcement to share with you all. I am thrilled to let you know that I have successfully defended my Ph.D. dissertation and I am currently navigating the job market. Now that I have completed my doctoral studies, I feel less burdened and can focus more energy on bringing you this podcast. You can expect more frequent episodes featuring conversations with brilliant thinkers from the fields of education, AI, and culture. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to share something special I've been working on. I've recently launched a YouTube Kids channel called Equations and Echoes, where science sings and the universe hums back. I turn science and math into unforgettable songs that educate, inspire, and stick in your head. Whether you are a curious child or a lifelong learner, the melodic stories make complex ideas simple and fun.
We live inside the Milky Way with stars that shine both night and day. It's shaped just like a pancake wide with glowing stars on every side. It holds the earth, the moon, the sun, and planets spinning one by one. It's full of dust and space so deep, where stars are born and stars can sleep.
That was a sample from my recent Milky Way song. You can find more joyful STEM learning through music on the Equations and Echoes YouTube channel. It is an open educational resource I have created as part of my mission to transform learning through AI and art. Now let's dive into today's conversation. The following is a conversation with Dr. Leslie Gruis, a mathematician and a privacy expert who obtained her PhD in applied mathematics and engineering sciences from Northwestern University. She served as an intelligence officer for the United States National Security Agency for 30 years, where she developed disruptive technology solutions to national security challenges and became the first president of the NSA's Women in Mathematics Society. As a senior intelligence officer, Dr. Gruis contributed to critical debates on privacy and civil liberties from within the intelligence community. Her expertise spans from the US Cyber Command to the National Intelligence Council, and since retirement, she has focused on privacy advocacy and mentoring K through 12 STEM students. This is the Culture Compute podcast, and now, dear friends, here is Dr. Leslie Gruis.
I was actually thinking about my students and their use of social media. I'm going to give you a story about a student that I had just the other day. I tutor um, secondary school, primarily emphasizing high school, but also middle schoolers, right? Middle school girls are my sweet spot because I'm a mathematician. And I know that we lose a lot of girls in the sciences in middle school. So I have a sweet spot for middle school girls. So I had a girl come to me the other day. She's in sixth grade. A lot of attitude, right? A lot of mean girl attitude, which is normal at this age, right? But everything was negative, right? What do you like to do? Nothing. Do you like to read books? No. Do you participate in any sports? No. What kinds of outside activities do you have? Nothing, right? Everything was negative, negative, negative with this girl. Now, a 12-year-old shouldn't feel like this about the world, right? I said, well, what do you do with your time? And she says, I'm on TikTok. And I said, aha, okay. I've been reading about this. Now there were some other things going on in her life that, she was a child of divorce and on and on. So there were other things going on. But here she is, 12 years old, completely addicted to TikTok, right? Which I find completely terrifying, right? And so if you read this book, Read or Come Home, it talks about how these social media applications are designed to be addictive, to build those cognitive pathways to make them just keep wanting more and more and more social media, which means, of course, these kids are getting lonelier and more depressed because they don't reach out in the real world to real people, right? It was just classic, right? And my background is not in education, right? My background is in mathematics. And yet I thought about this girl, I thought about her privacy, I thought about what she must be putting on TikTok. I thought about her comparing herself to her peers on TikTok. And then I thought of all the predators that might be out there because I'm suspicious, right? Predators that might be out there on TikTok trying to build a relationship with her. And so I went out afterwards, which I often do, and my tutoring center doesn't like it very much when I do this, but I went out and I met the mother just to see what she was like. And she seemed like a, nice person, has a real job and everything. And so I kind of mentioned my concern to her because these are the kinds of kids you read about in books, right? That get depressed, that are vulnerable for self harm. It's just really scary out there right now that kids don't respect the privacy of their space, their bodies, their thoughts, and they're willing to share all that on social media. So, in education, I would say that we really need to be thinking about the availability of social media and online tools hard because for these still forming brains, from what I've read, that frontal cortex is still forming at this age, right? It's not going to be mature. They're not going to have self control until their 20s, right? These are not the kind of neural pathways you want to be built in your kid's brain, right? And so I'm working very hard right now to get her to read a book. It's about a girl, her age, of course, and this girl becomes a refugee. And the initial steps I've made with her, it was a big concession for her to read a book at all, a physical book. And the first chapter I gave her to read was 5 whole pages. And then I had her summarize it. And what was interesting about the exercise was she was able to summarize the action very well, actually. It was actually going into her brain, right? But the other aspect that I'm looking for with a book like this is to help her build some empathy because I see this distinct lack of empathy in kids that live in this virtual space all the time, which some people say may account for some of the strife we're having in our society today of people not being able to put themselves in other people's shoes or be able to listen to them, which has profound implications for our higher education. When I was reading yesterday, I learned that at universities, students are much more likely today to complain about the professor not protecting them from offensive content, which to me is kind of astounding. So it has something to do with the way we're raising our children. And I'm not well enough educated in this subject area to speak to it further, but I think we really need to look at the research and the results and ask ourselves, what are we doing to our kids, right? What is it we're doing wrong? You know, for everybody that has their first child, you have that immense feeling of responsibility and also of I have no idea what I'm doing. Right? I have no idea what I'm doing. What my parents did back then might not be the right thing to do today. Right? My parents didn't have to contend with cell phones, smartphones, social media. It didn't exist. Right? So, what's a parent to do today faced with all these technological advances?
That's true. There is this, I'm sure you've heard of this topic called techno solutionism. It is the idea that we feel technology can help us solve all issues. We assume that it is what it is for. When Facebook was launched a long time ago, just paralleling what you just mentioned, people loved Facebook. After 10 years, decades after a decade passed, we see all these children, even adults, getting suicidal thoughts, going into depression, lack of empathy, really rude, toxicity, toxic behavior, and all that. It's really terrible that it's happening to children. Clearly, when we were in school a long time ago, 30 years ago, phones were never heard of. We don't have technology like this. But now everything is one click away. And all the clicks that you make are just taking you down the rabbit hole, low culture and low culture and low culture. The most toxic thing you will ever want to be in. And nobody's teaching these kids that don't do that, or to make them think that there is a barrier, there's no boundaries to prevent them from going down there. It's really interesting that you are working with that girl to make her read. I'm pretty sure there are some withdrawal symptoms.
There will be if they take TikTok away. And her mother, who is a single parent now, um, may not be able to sustain the battle. In other words, there will be a huge battle if they try to take her social media away now. Right. Of course, there's a huge battle already every day about phone use and social media use, probably as well. And so a lot of the experts are basically saying just don't give them social media, don't give them smartphones when they're that young, right? Wait till high school for a smartphone. Wait till they're 16 for social media. Now, I realize that is an almost unsustainable position in the face of a raging preteen or teenager who is intent that she's going to have this or he's going to have this because all his friends do. But there are other solutions to that problem. There are non smartphones if it's a question of contact. There's also thinking about your community. I think one thing that perhaps has made us vulnerable is the decline of spiritual beliefs in our country, right? People don't have a sense of community or of rootedness, right? If you had a sense of community and your community decided that there were going to be no smartphones for kids before they were 16, that would mean those kids would have to go outside and play and invent games. And that's what they should be doing because they're kids, right? All that play is just rehearsal for adulthood, right? We have 3 kittens at our house right now, and I watch them every day, and they play rough and tumble and attack and chase. They are all just rehearsing the adult skills that they need. And so these kids should be rehearsing these physical skills or these thinking skills or these deep reading skills, right? Not living in a virtual world with superficial friendships.
I 100% agree with you. There is also, I think, a peer pressure. If you, as my classmate, have a smartphone and you are chatting, I don't have a phone and I'm not able to communicate with you, that also builds up a pressure, a hypothetical pressure that I am missing out on this. FOMO, fear of missing out. It's the young generation's lingo.
I understand that. A lot of schools in the United States are banning cell phones in schools. In my local jurisdiction in the autumn, um, the phones will be banned in elementary school and middle school during the school day. They have to be off and stowed all day long. For high schoolers, the phones have to be off and away during class. Okay, so I think you're going to hopefully, this is going to be less of an influence for young minds if these schools enforce these new policies. And they're doing it because all the research says that these devices are not healthy for developing brains, right? They're not doing it to be mean. Um, and I've been even talking at the tutoring center where I work. I've been talking to the supervisor and saying, it'd be really good if we could just get rid of the smartphones during our classes. They don't really need them, right? So I think at least the education system is moving in the right direction with respect to smartphones.
It's a good educated decision. I also saw recent news about the cell phone software vendors such as Apple or Google's Android. They are being now forced to enable age verification. If they do that, maybe it is one door that they must pass. Only then they are able to access whatever they want to access. If they are below that age, it's not going to let them in.
Right. I think there is a place here for Congress to step in, right? The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which was passed in the late 90s, there has been an ongoing debate about updating it. Right now, it bans social media use. I believe it's below 13 because that was what they could get to yes on. The experts are recommending up to 16. So there's work to be done there. It's almost like this technology has given kids the worst of all worlds, right? Because a smartphone, it has remarkable capabilities, right? It has the capabilities of what was decades ago a supercomputer, right? And yet, uh, kids don't necessarily use it for educational purposes, right? They use it for social media. Uh, Boys may use it to watch porn. Girls may, it just kind of goes on and on. And so it's very worrisome that they have this technology. I think Congress could also step in. There's been an ongoing debate about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically says that all these platforms, these social media platforms, are not responsible for the content that people put up on them. And this has been a subject of great debate. And this is what's behind the ongoing debate about social media not being treated as a publisher, right? If you're a publisher of a mainstream newspaper, you have liability for the content that appears on your pages. Well, social media doesn't have that. And so this gets us to long debates and Supreme Court cases about whether a young person recruited by social media becoming a terrorist, whether the social media platform has liability for this. There were two cases like this last year in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court basically deferred on both of them. So I think it's up to Congress to go back and review this particular section of the Communications Decency Act, this Section 230 thing. There are good reasons for why it was put in place initially. And in a way, it kind of goes to your, what did you call it? Your techno solutionism, right? So the reasons behind such laws were, oh, we need to open up the door for technology to innovate because we might fall behind, right? This is always the argument why we should let technologists do things. Well, they're not fledgling organizations anymore. Okay, so this law was passed again in the late 1990s. These are no longer fledgling organizations that need special things, special provisions to compensate for their newness anymore. They should be treated like big kids, right? And this is something that the Federal Trade Commission weighs in on a regular basis, is this idea about free competition, anti-monopoly, and consumer protection. And consumer protection is often at right angles to open competition and anti-monopoly, right? We free things up for the technological companies to compete, and yet we don't necessarily think about the impact on the consumers. And now look today at what social media is doing to its youngest consumers.
Really important points you're bringing up there. It reminds me of one really simple example. It's like you are working with dough to make pizza, but that dough, you can make a pizza, small, large, half, whatever shape you like. You can put anything on it. And the education community, generally speaking, tries to make that dough into, imagine the dough as a child. Uh, we want it to blossom into a educated, successful human later on. But all this toxicity from big tech, they are not making that happen. The pizza will never blossom. I used to go to my professor a long time ago and after a class and tell them that, "Hey, thanks for the class. I learned this. I look forward to the next class." That is gone completely out of the education system. Everybody's waiting for the bell to ring or the class to end. And while you are in the class, they're always checking the phone. It's annoying that we have ultimately gone to that level of addiction on these little phones, which have become huge distractors in educational contexts.
I am famous for always having a book with me wherever I go. And even if I'm meeting friends for lunch, I have a book with me. Why? Because if I'm sitting there waiting for them and they're really late, I'm going to be annoyed. I'm going to be grumpy. We are not going to have a happy lunch, okay? On the other hand, if I have a book, and I'm really into my books usually, right? I can sit and happily read 4 hours and be in a perfectly good mood when they do show up, right? So I always have a book in tow. So when I'm with someone and they start living on their phone when I'm physically present, I put away my phone and I get out my book. So I'm trying really hard to build those deep reading neural networks that I might have lost by spending too much time on my cell phone and dig into my book. I could also, just in a sort of annoyed way, say, hey, I'm over here. Hello, right? We came to be together. Why don't you put that stupid phone down and pay attention to me and talk to me? Is the other thing you could do, of course.
That's true. You know what? I just learned that from you. When somebody in front of me is using a phone, which tends to be a common occurrence, I will just pull up a book from now onwards. Maybe maybe I will use that as a extrinsic motivator for my peers to see what Sai is using a book. What is so interesting that I'm not finding it on a little phone?
Oh, well, when I'm tutoring my kids, they'll get mad at me when we're doing reading exercises at the SAT level, and they'll say, "Well, I don't know that word. How was I supposed to know that word?" And I'll say, "Well, of course, if you had read books when you were younger, you would have a bigger vocabulary today, right?" And they, of course, get really annoyed with me. But I learned wonderful vocabulary, right, by carrying around my books. Because when I encounter a word I don't know, I underline it very lightly in pencil. I look it up on my phone and I write the definition down, right, in hopes that eventually it's going to stick in my brain if it shows up a few more times, right? So I'm also building my vocabulary when I carry around my books.
Rapper Jay-Z,
Hmm.
amazing songs he sings and raps. Apparently, when he was a little boy, his teacher gave him, I believe for his birthday, a dictionary as a gift. He went home, he read it many times, and he became a rapper. Now he makes songs using those vocabulary, and he's become a millionaire. Books do make millionaires.
Yes, they do.
That's a interesting article I read on NPR, but just adds value to what you're saying there, that we are not really encouraging learners. The readability has gone down, math literacy has gone down, numeracy skills have gone down, especially in girls. It's really terrifying to see that happen in this convergence of all these fields playing together, but as an ultimate end user, the learner, little children, they have no idea that their data is always being mined, and they are being bombarded with ads or being sold products or services without them having no clue about this. Just generally speaking about this, I know you have a extensive background in national security, but when you do apply those skills you gained and all the professional career you built in that field to classrooms, how do the lessons from the cybersecurity and data mining or maybe surveillance, all this ethical ways translate to today's usage of AI in our classrooms? What do you think?
So let me answer that. That's got a longer answer. So first of all, I'm trained as a mathematician. That's what my PhD is in. So the great thing about being a mathematician is that you're not trained in any particular discipline, right? You get to work across disciplines. So you can work, and I did this in my career at the National Security Agency, right? I could be working in a problem in electrical engineering, and then I could be working a problem having to do with physics, and I could be working a problem having to do with computational linguistics, and then I could be working in big data, and I was working in big data before big data even became big data, right? Actually, the first big data users were actually the astronomers, by the way. The computer scientists did not invent that, in spite of what you might believe, right? So that's the great thing about being a mathematician. The bad thing about being a mathematician, of course, is you're not trained in any particular discipline, right? So everywhere you go, you got to give yourself at least 2 weeks to catch up because every discipline has its own language and its own vocabulary for things that are mathematically very familiar to you, but you've never heard those labels applied, right? So, in a lot of ways, I take that background when I approach my students, right? I spend time getting to know them, what motivates them. I try to understand their learning style. I try to establish rapport with them. I try to give them examples that are relevant to them. As for my other work at the National Security Agency, I was a technologist, but I ended up spending a fair amount of time with the lawyers. Um, so there's always this rock and a hard place, and this is something that our government struggles with every day, is showing respect for the civil rights of its citizens while balancing also the needs that we have for national security, right? These are conflicting forces, right? They compete against one another. And depending on what's going on in the world, the balance may tip one way or the other. So, for example, after 9/11, the scale tipped towards national security and maybe less in civil rights because we were all petrified that we were vulnerable, right? Then it tips back the other way. So it tipped back the other way, for example, most during the 1960s with the civil rights movement, right? So there's always this ebb and flow in government practice between national security and the respect for individual rights. So in my work with the lawyers as a technologist, I was always the one explaining to them technologically the capabilities of the technology, decently versed in civil rights, but not a lawyer myself, right? And they would say, "Well, yeah, I think this is okay. This is not okay. We can't do this," right? And so there was that dynamic tension between what can the technology do and what should we let the technology do, right? Because we shouldn't always let the technology do whatever it wants. That's a lesson for today, right? Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? There's a wonderful scene in the movie Jurassic Park where Dr. Ian Malcolm, the mathematician and hero, I would like to point out, of the story, who says, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." Right? Sometimes we get so carried away with the potential of being able to do something technologically, we don't stop and think, is this something desirable? Is this something good for people? Or is this something that's going to be dangerous to people? Maybe we need to stop and think about this a little bit, right? So when automobiles were first invented, I'm sure there were many, many automobile accidents involving pedestrians because people didn't know to expect a car was coming down the street, right? But over time, people became attuned to the automobile environment. Different kinds of laws came into place. I'm sure it meant that police forces were supplemented, that traffic lights eventually came into being, crosswalks, right? We came to a happy medium with the automobile. So the question is, how do we come to a happy medium with today's technology? So all those lessons I learned working at the National Security Agency, I now apply to my work environment. I question whether technology is the solution for kids. And I spend time getting to know the kids and their learning style and their approach so I can find a common vocabulary and build empathy with them.
I really love that, especially when the kids go back to their homes. They, the first thing they might do is quickly go catch up with what's the notifications are on their phones or the game invites or on Discord, whatever. But it's all a digital life they are living. And you are trying to put all those lives back into like the physicality, the physical nature, where there is so much more to explore. It's not just a digital being. You're not just a zero or one, but you have a physical nature, embodied nature that you can interact with. I really appreciate your efforts, first of all, encouraging young minds to connect back with the actual environment.
It's a long haul. An hour and 50 minutes is a long haul for my younger kids. And so oftentimes, if we get sort of to the end of what they can stand, and you could usually tell, for the last 10 or 15 minutes, I'll let them, if I have more than one, it's easier. I'll let them play a game. Okay. Now, Uno is very popular still in case anybody had any doubts. But we also, I've been working on getting them to play Scrabble as well, because that helps with vocabulary, right? Just to give them that time to be social with their peers, to learn to take turns, to learn to be a good loser, to agree upon the rules, to adjudicate a disagreement about the rules in the middle of the game, right? If I have more than one, I'll usually just turn them loose to play Uno while I catch up on my workbooks and see how they do. Because those social skills are the things they missed out on during COVID. They need extra practice. So I would argue that that is social education in interacting with others and learning to get along and to communicate.
You are trying to be like a good grandma. I'm sorry I called you a grandma,
That's okay.
but as a good teacher, in Germany, there is a statement, German language, but the goal is that will you do that to your grandchildren? Think about your grandchildren. So I think that is what you're doing. And I really appreciate that from an educational perspective. It's really terrific that you are doing
So
that.
I think the good thing, the reason that I can dabble in legal, you know, thinking and in education is because I'm not prejudiced by having been trained in those arenas, right? So as a mathematician, I continue to dabble in many subjects, right? For education, it's just common sense to me, right? Having had a child, a boy of my own, I know all about little boys, right? I know how they think, I know what they're up to. I anticipate it because you have to keep on top of them. Little girls, sometimes I have a tougher time with because little girls, I had a bias that they were all delicate and I was going to make them cry if I was hard on them. But that's not true. Actually, there are some very tough little girls out there and they require a measure of uh, guidance that's more what I would have expected to apply to a little boy, right? But every one of them is different, right? So you just have to live and learn, right? Figure it out.
That's true. I am only now realizing I haven't asked you what grades are these children?
Oh, anything from 3 to 20, primarily high school and middle school, but I get little kids sometimes too.
Okay. These are really vulnerable age groups. You can easily make them change their trajectory through social media, digital devices. And I see how you are putting that back into an unplugged environment by giving them proper mentorship, proper guidance in the context of privacy as a civic right. Since you have worked with lawyers before, what does it mean for privacy to be civic, not just technical? What do you think about that?
So, my first book on privacy, which was called Privacy Past, Present, and Future, was an academic approach on the subject of privacy. It's very long. I don't expect many people will read it. But luckily, from it was distilled the second book, uh, which was The Privacy Pirates. And that's 100 pithy pages for everybody out there. Uh, Easy reading. You should be able to knock it off in an afternoon, right? The biggest word in there is bicameral. I assume that everybody in America knows what bicameral means, but we can have a Latin lesson if we need to, because I do teach words according to Latin roots now, which is another thing that really helps with vocabulary skills. So privacy, when I went looking for privacy, when this all started after I retired from the government, I didn't know where the origins of privacy were in the United States, right? I spent a lot of time reading English constitutional history, which was interesting but painful, okay? So, of course, everyone probably knows that the roots of our Constitution go back to the Magna Carta in England in 1215, signed by bad King John. Um, there were rights in there that were guaranteed. Their spirit is in our Bill of Rights today. So, if you were to look at the Declaration of Independence and at the Constitution, the word privacy does not appear in it, either one, which is interesting, right? So you think, well, privacy couldn't have been part of the origin of this country. But that's not so, because privacy is implicit in the Bill of Rights, right? The fact in the Fourth Amendment that I have the right to be in my home and free from search and seizure, that's a privacy right, right? The First Amendment rights, my freedom of religion, that's a privacy right. My right to practice whatever religion I want. Free speech, my right to say whatever I want. And so on, and so on, and so on. So privacy actually lives in the Bill of Rights. It just wasn't called out as a word in the legal vernacular of US law until a law review article in the 1890s, where it was called out. And interestingly enough, the right to privacy was called out, and the review article was about actually technology. Very self-serving, isn't it?
Right.
So it was
Cool.
about the fact that a reporter had gotten into somebody's home and taken pictures during a wedding, and they didn't want the reporter there. That's how this whole thing sort of came up, right? These more user-friendly cameras, were just coming into being at that point in time, right? Photography had been invented around 1830, but Kodak came around 1890, right? So all of a sudden, cameras are more prolific, right? Easier to get into places. Somebody doesn't have to stand still for 3 minutes or whatever anymore, right? So the right to privacy was actually born because of technology. It was called out in a law review article. Um, one of the writers was Brandeis, who would go on to become a Supreme Court judge and write an important dissent in the 1920s about privacy. So that's where the idea of privacy comes from. It's something that Americans grow up with. It's something, at least in my generation, I should say, I grew up in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill with patriotic parents during the 1960s. So you can imagine what my home environment was like, right? We were patriots, but I wasn't browbeat over the head with it every day, right? It was just part of my being as I grew up. It was all very natural to me. So a right to privacy was a part of my upbringing. I'm not sure if that's true today. I sometimes wonder, right? But it is among our fundamental rights. And why do we have those rights? Well, if you read your US history, you'll find out that we reserve those rights because we want to control the power of government, right? If the government has the power over my free speech and I'm not allowed to disagree, then that's not a democracy or a republic, right? That's a dictatorship, right? So actually, privacy is an essential feature of our democracy. And if you're willing to give up on privacy, then you're really saying you're willing to give up on democracy. So that's why I feel so passionately about the subject of privacy.
Do you see any cultural barriers that persist, specifically girls in STEM, kids that you're teaching?
So let me answer the question this way. I went to work at NSA in 1987, and up until 1993, there were no more women mathematicians with PhDs hired. So the senior women mathematicians at NSA got together and we hosted the Women in Mathematics Symposium. We brought in academics from across the United States to explain to them the opportunities we had for female mathematicians at the National Security Agency. We showed our hand more than we ever had. This was before the era of transparency, right? We hadn't gotten to transparency. So we still had a little bit of that Cold War mindset still to overcome. But we showed our hand much more obviously. And as a result of that, the women of NSA, the mathematicians, got together and we started participating in the recruiting process much more actively. We worked with the recruiting office. We went to the national math meetings, which are typical in many academic fields. It's where mathematicians go to look for jobs in the academic world and in other places. So those joint math meetings are held in January, usually on the East Coast or the West Coast. We would send lots of female mathematicians to those meetings. We would be a force to be reckoned with, right? People couldn't help but remark on how many female mathematicians from NSA were at this conference, right? It helped us with the recruiting, but it helped us with the human aspect, the personal touch. You know, you could sit down and have lunch with one of us, and we could answer the kinds of questions that maybe were preying on your mind, but you wouldn't ask a recruiter. Like, I really want to get married and have babies in the next 5 years. What's going to happen to my job? Right? Things like that. These are really concerns for women at this stage, right? At some point in time, in your mid 20s or by the time you're 30, you start thinking about that biological clock and you don't want to put off having kids too long, right? Or it could get really complicated, right? So these are important concerns for these young women who could be anywhere from 22 to 30, right? If they're just getting out with a bachelor's, master's, or PhD, right? So we gave it the personal touch. We actually prepared a flyer that answered some of those hard questions. We built a connection network so that while people were going through the process of being hired, which can be very lengthy because of the security clearance process, that we would reach out and keep in touch with people. This actually served NSA as well. Because what happens to these women is they come in and they spend 3 to 5 years learning to be NSA mathematicians, right? You don't want to invest 3 to 5 years in a person if they're just going to say, oh, I want to have children and I see no choice, so I'm going to quit my job. No, right? We gave them choices, right? We had a very lenient time off policy. We had nursing mothers' rooms. We had fathers that took paternity leave, right? We had all sorts of variations on the theme, right, in order to retain that workforce. So I think that that answers the question at the professional world level is that people began working harder to recruit women into the math and the sciences as employees. So that helped. That means that girls now have more role models like
Mm.
me to say, oh, I can still study math and get a job. That sounds pretty cool, right? As for them turning away, all the research that I had read up until quite recently said it was during puberty that we lose these girls, right? I encourage all my students equally. I tell my girls they can do this. I work with them. I think sometimes there's some math phobia that's developed. Maybe some impatient person told them once they couldn't do math, and that idea stuck in their head, right? I have to undo that. I have boys that have that too, by the way. I have boys with math phobia also. Um, and I just exude confidence that they can master the skills one at a time,
Mm.
right? I believe in them. That's the only thing that I really do is I help them build their self-esteem. I give them the basic skills, but sometimes a bigger part of the problem is coming over the mental conviction that you can't do it, right? It's like I had a student the other day who was studying for, I can't remember if it was the SAT or the ACT, but every single problem involving the lengths of shadows using trigonometry, this student just had a mental block about doing those problems, right? So I gave it a name, right? I said, okay, you just have a mental block about these problems. We are going to do a lot of these problems. And eventually, you're not going to have a block about it because you're going to know exactly how to do it, right? So it's the same thing I do with the younger kids. I had an 11th grade girl one day who was having troubles in math. It turned out she couldn't add fractions. Somehow along the way, she had missed learning how to add fractions. So I don't have any opinion on that. I say, oh, okay, you must have just missed that. We're going to do that now, right? We go back, we fix it. She's doing beautifully now, right? So my job, the hardest part of my job is trying to figure out what is the problem, right? What is it that's giving them pause, right? Why are they having a hard time with this? And then trying to find a way to fix it.
I want to just quickly talk about your book. Why did you choose to write that book? The Privacy Pirates. I love that title, by the way.
So the first book was me learning the subject of privacy enough from the legal point of view that I could sort of have an appreciation, right, of how we got here, how technology shaped how we got here, how the law shaped how we got here, how events shaped how we got here, right? How we adopted all the best business practices from the business world when it came to coming up with frameworks for cybersecurity and for privacy and for security. And I guess if I were to update the book for AI now, right? So that's what the first book was really about. The second book was meant to be the popular trade book. So I took the first book and I squashed out all the excess stuff and I put just the essential elements into the second book in a quick, breezy read so that people could understand where privacy came from, but it also had a storyline to pull the reader through. So there's a storyline about a a girl who is, I believe, 14 in the book. Her name is Alice, right? Alice and her family suffer some privacy adventures, right? So Alice herself is the victim of having someone posting her head on a scantily clad body, right? So her father is a lawyer. He gets very upset and discovers that there's really nothing he can do, right? Her mother gets into privacy woes in her medical environment, and they go around on that. And then, of course, her Grandma Ruby, is the one who's been there, seen it, and always said, "Oh, it's just like the old days," right? So that storyline pulls the reader through, right? So you get a couple pages of storyline and then the exposition of the chapter. Where did privacy come from? Why is it important? Right? And then you get a couple more pages of storyline and then more exposition, right? So it's meant to help draw the reader through, especially if it's a high schooler, right? To make it more interesting so that they really follow the story through. And I intentionally shortened it so that it's only 100 and some pages. And there's a very nice, I can't remember how it's labeled, appendix of law terms at the very end that a lawyer friend of mine helped me with to make sure, because terms in the law change over time, right? Freedom of the press originally meant a printing press, right? Right? Like a physical thing, right? And so press now, for a while you think of the newspaper press, but now freedom of the press has to do with digitally published media as well, right? So terms evolve over time or they respond to events, right? And so I tried to sort of pull that through in the appendix and say, well, this term originally kind of meant that, but after the civil rights movement, it kind of meant this, and right. So things change over time, and so it's important that you don't just key off those original words that you might have read as written by the forefathers without understanding in the modern context what it means, how it's evolved over time. So that's why the short book.
Some cool ideas you just sparked in my mind. Who knows, we might co-author a short article because it has come, the time has come to alert slash educate many people, citizens of planet Earth, about the new age of privacy and what it means, especially when everybody's doing ChatGPT or there are many other tools like that that are 24 hours a day collecting everything you do and improving their systems. And as users of these tools, we have no idea. They're essentially making money.
Of course they are. You're being commoditized.
Yes, yes. And I see a gap in literature to discuss this in writing. You gave me some ideas that I would love to have you as a co-author, as a short article. I really, really enjoyed spending this time with you.
Oh, me too, Sai. It was wonderful.
I want to really thank you, Dr. Leslie Gruis, for this illuminating and urgent conversation. Again, you have reminded us that the questions we ask using technology can be AI or any technology, especially in education. They're not just technical, they are fundamentally the convergence of civic, cultural, and deeply human. And I see from your experience working in national security contexts and now teaching young minds to be more connected with the environment and towards an unplugged learning. I really commend you on that. And from your decades of national security to your advocacy for privacy and digital ethics, I truly believe your voice helps reframe how we see learners, children, adult learners, not just as data points or users of some technology, but as future educated citizens with rights and agency and the power to shape the systems around them. Before we conclude, Dr. Gruis, would you like to pitch in your social media accounts where our listeners
Oh,
can follow
so
you?
so much to everyone's um, amazement, I'm actually not on any social media except LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, but I do not have a Facebook account or Twitter or X or any of the other animals at the zoo because I think social media is basically evil. And so, you know what? We could fix the social media problem very easily if everybody would just stop using it. Okay, so just get off Facebook and pick up the telephone and call your friend or send them a text.
I agree. Or write them a letter.
Right. So, but anyway, I am on LinkedIn and I am scratching the surface of a lot of these issues. The thing that got the most attention was I posted yesterday was about Sweden moving away from digital education. That I put up last night and already had a lot of likes on it this morning. And they're concerned about the deleterious effects of digital media for children. And so they have actually decided to move away from that. And they're actually going to get kids to read real physical books, believe it or not.
Isn't that amazing? That I love, because they're not just doing that to have a capitalistic mindset to draw money from various data points, but they truly care. And that is what Sweden appears to be doing there.
Exactly.
Is there anything else you like to cover which I may have missed during our conversation?
No, I would just encourage everybody to stop and think about how important privacy is to our democracy. And if you give it up, then that undermines the strength of our nation. So, just in the spirit of the 4th of July, think about that.
Now, to my listeners, if today's conversation sparked questions or gave you language for something that you have been sensing but could not quite articulate, share this episode, talk about it with a colleague, a student, or a parent. You will find links to Leslie Gruis's LinkedIn and her recent book in the show notes. This is Sai Gattupalli from the Culture Compute Podcast, signing off from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Until next time, keep computing culture.